2019. Ambassador Taylor also served as the U.S. government's representative to the Mideast Quartet, which facilitated the Israeli disengagement from Gaza and parts of the West Bank. He served in Baghdad as the first director of the Iraq Reconstruction Management Office from 2004 to 2005, and in Kabul as coordinator of international and U.S. assistance to Afghanistan from 2002 to 2003. Ambassador Taylor was also coordinator for U.S. assistance to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. He earlier served on the staff of Senator Bill Bradley. Ambassador Taylor is a graduate of West Point and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and in Germany. Ambassador Taylor, welcome, albeit virtually, to Montana. Thank you so much for coming on. How are you?
Chris, thank you. I'm great. I'm very pleased to be here. I wish I were there, but I have been to Montana and have driven through. And as everyone knows, the sky there is enormous. It's a great state. I look forward to visiting you, and I'm very pleased to be able to have this conversation with the World Affairs Council, Chris.
Well, thanks again for joining. Of course, we'd love to have you here in person. It is an open invitation now and forever. Whoever comes on our webcast is always welcome to come and see us in person. Ambassador Taylor, of course, your phone has not stopped ringing for the past couple months on Ukraine. I wonder if I could just kick this off by asking you a very general question. If you could kind of share your perspective on the Ukraine, just generally the situation now, but importantly to connect that to us here in Montana and in the United States, and why does this matter to us? Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Chris. It is exactly the right question. So there are two answers to that question, Chris. One is kind of principles of foreign policy that do affect all of us. These are not just abstract principles that I'll mention, but because they affect whether or not we have a world that is at peace or a world that is war. And we know that a world at war affects every person in the world, whether they're fighting in that fight, in that battle, in that war or not, because as we've seen today, oil prices are going up because to a large degree because of this war. There are other factors, as we know, but the war exacerbates these. Food prices are going up. Again, there are other factors, but Ukraine and Russia are two very large growers of grains in the world. And when they are restricted or unable to export, that affects prices of everything that's developed onto from the grain that comes. Prices go up everywhere. It affects a lot of people in poorer countries, but it affects us as well. So the first answer to your question, Chris, which is a good one. Why do we care? Because we care about what kind of a world we live in, our kids live in, your students that are there in the classrooms thinking about this. Is it a world where big countries, big strong countries dominate and maybe even invade smaller countries, causing that war, causing that disruption, causing those refugee flights across the borders, resulting in these horrible pictures we're seeing, the senseless violence that is accompanied by wars. Wars are terrible, and the question for us in the bigger picture is how can we come up with a world where all of us in Montana, in Indiana, in Washington, in Kiev, Ukraine, how can we design a world that we want to live in, that doesn't result in these wars, it doesn't result in these disruptions, it doesn't result in these horrible pictures that we're seeing coming out of this war, out of the war in Ukraine. And so one way to think about that is the period of time between World War II and 2014, that period of time when there was general adherence to, general respect for principles of how nations deal with each other. And the first principle was we respected each other's sovereignty. It didn't matter if they were big or small nations, but nations were sovereign. They get to make their own decisions. The nations get to decide who they trade with. Nations get to decide who they decide their leaders. They decide who they want to associate with politically. The nations are sovereign. Borders are inviolable. During that period of time, from 1945 to 2014, no nation invaded another nation with the intent of changing the borders. That changed, of course, in 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine. So Russia violated that principle that had kind of kept the peace, not perfectly, as we know, but it had kind of kept the peace kept to a lower level of conflict during that 69-year period that ended in 2014. So if we want to get back to a world that we want to live in, that we want our children and our grandchildren to live in, then we need to go back to the respect for sovereignty of nations. We need to go back for the respect for borders and that going away from this bad notion that might makes right. That cannot be right. That cannot be right. It has to be some set of rules, of principles, of understandings, of treaties that makes it clear that nations are sovereign. So that's kind of the bigger picture. But Chris, let me do one other thing, which it appeals to me on a more moral basis, and it appeals to every individual who thinks about these kinds of issues. So everybody listening to us, participating in this discussion today, will have a moral reaction to what's going on in Ukraine. And for Americans, we have a moral responsibility to the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen and the Marines that fight for us. Our military fights for us on our behalf. They are on the front line for us. Most of us are not on the front line. Most of us aren't in the military. Most of us are living our lives. And when we have to fight, and sometimes we do, then our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines do that for us because they're on the front line. And this is the punchline here, Chris. Ukraine is on the front line for us. Ukraine is fighting the Russians. The Ukrainians didn't pick this fight. They didn't provoke this fight. They didn't want this fight. They did nothing to justify this fight. They did nothing that would have justified the Russian invasion of their country, killing tens of thousands of Ukrainian citizens, military and civilians. We see the civilians dead on the streets. They didn't ask for this. They are fighting it themselves, but they're fighting for us. And just like we support our soldiers, we should support Ukrainians. And if we do, then they will prevail. They will prevail. And we will live in a better world. And we will have the benefits of a peaceful world, but we have to support the Ukrainians right now.
Ambassador Taylor, thank you so much for that introduction, getting us kind of in the same place on the situation and why that matters to us. Now, I'm going to leave the camera on you, but I want you to know that you're joined here by 25 very interested citizens who were lucky enough to RSVP early and get a seat in the room. So although I have a list of questions as long as my arm, I would like to open it up now to the room to see about questions from you. I'll also remind people that number one, we have 5 classrooms from across Montana who are joining us. They might be chatting in some questions to you, Ambassador, and that you should all feel free now to please go ahead. Over to you, room. Guests, questions. Bob.
Mr. Ambassador, the assessment from my perspective at the moment is this is just the beginning, that this invasion and the consequences will last significantly longer than what I believe anybody thinks it may. Putin has been embarrassed militarily, economically, and politically in terms of the world coming together in a way that we have not seen in generations. He is not going to go quietly into the night. So I'd be very interested in your assessment on the premise that I'm speaking to, as is this unfortunately going to get far worse before we see things possibly taking the course that gets us to a better place?
That's a great question. Chris, do I understand that was Bob asking this question?
Yep, that's Bob, correct.
Good, good. It helps me to, so Bob, a great question. And I look at the question you asked, that is, how does this end? Where does this go? Does it go long, as it might, and I fear it will? Or is there some other outcome? So let me just sketch two. The first is the shorter one. It's the more optimistic one. Maybe it's less likely, but let's at least think about it. So far, the Ukrainian military has been heroic and has stopped the Russian military in its attempt to go down and run down the river that comes from Belarus and Russia down into Ukraine, right to the capital Kyiv. The Ukrainian military stopped them, turned them back, fought them off, pushed them back. And now we see the Russian military redeploying, moving away from Kyiv. They've given up on that. They've concluded they're not going to take Kyiv. And we don't know exactly what they're going to do, but it looks like they're moving more towards the east. Where they really started, again, we remember that this didn't start on February 24th of 2022. It really started back in 2014 when the Russians invaded the first time. And they invaded both Crimea in the south, but also this little part of the eastern part of Ukraine called Donbass. And that's where the Russians seem to be moving back toward, trying to be sure that they can hold on to Donbass and probably Crimea. And so what we learned from that is Ukrainian military is doing very well. Russian military is doing very badly. And President Putin, in this first scenario, and then I'll get to the longer one, Bob, that you just sketched out. But in the first scenario, President Putin figures out that he's not going to achieve on the battlefield what he had hoped. Maybe all he can do is hold on to what he started with back in 2014, back in Donbass. Or maybe he's going to try to do a little bit more than that. But at some point, he figures out that his army is not doing very well. His army is almost out of its regular troops. He's looking for troops to come in from Syria and Libya and even private companies to come fight. So when he figures out that he's not going to win on the battlefield, he may sit down to negotiate with President Zelensky. There have been some attempts already, even before President Putin has figured this out, has come to that conclusion. So right now, President Putin has not made that decision to sit down and negotiate, but he's had his people talking with the Ukrainians and maybe sketching out some ideas. And we can talk about these ideas later on. If that happens, Bob, that could mean that the violence, the first thing on the Ukrainians' mind for this negotiation is a ceasefire, and the second is a withdrawal, and then third is some discussion about how to go forward after that. But if that scenario holds, and I'm prepared to admit that it's probably less than 50-50. This scenario, the negotiation scenario, if you will. But if that holds, then the killing can stop, and the Ukrainians and the Russians will negotiate on who gets what. There's some discussion, for example, of Ukraine becoming a neutral country instead of applying to NATO. They might agree, they might offer to become a neutral country. The Ukrainians are thinking about a lot of different ways to ensure their own security, and that negotiation could take place, and that could happen, in months. The other scenario is the one, Bob, that you sketch out, which is the bloodier one, the more people dying one, and that is neither side gives up soon. President Putin continues to think that if he just throws more Russian soldiers at this fight, he will eventually win. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, will never stop fighting. They will never stop fighting. Ukrainians know themselves better than I do, but I know the Ukrainians well, and I know they will not stop fighting. They are a people, they're a nation, they're a civilization that is proud of where they've come from. They're proud of their history, their language, their heroes. They will not give that up. They've been independent and free for 30 years. They know what it's like to live that way as an independent sovereign nation, free of domination by the Russians. They don't want to go back to that. And they'll fight to the end. They will fight to the end. In that scenario, though, Bob, we need to continue to support them. If they're going to continue this fight, they need our help. They need ammunition, they need fuel, they need weapons. They will, and if they have that, they'll continue to fight. The Russians, in the end, will lose. Even in that long scenario, they will lose. Their troops are demoralized already. Their conscripts don't know why they're in Ukraine. They're not even supposed to be in Ukraine, the conscripts. But they show up in Ukraine and they don't know why. They don't know what they're fighting for. The Ukrainians know what they're fighting for, and they'll continue to do that. The Russians don't. So in the end, like in Afghanistan, Bob, you remember when the Russians went into Afghanistan, they went in hot, and 10 years later, they dragged out the Afghans, pushed them out. Ukraine is much more of a nation. Ukraine is much more of a people, of a nation than Afghanistan, and they will push the Russians out. I'm convinced. However long it takes, that will happen. So that's my longer answer. Sorry to go on like that, but that's, I think, an important for us to understand. It might be a shorter negotiation, it might be a longer fight, but in the end, Ukrainians will prevail.
Greg.
And Ambassador Taylor, that being said, is there any way, do you see any way that this will ultimately end without the Donbass being in Russian hands? Either through negotiation or fighting?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. Is it Greg? Is that what I understand?
Yes, Greg.
Yeah, Greg. It's a very good question. My bet is, so we know a little bit of the outlines of a possible agreement that the Ukrainians and the Russians have been talking about in Istanbul. They also started these negotiations up on the border between Belarus and Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, and have both face-to-face as well as Zoom calls like this, negotiation between Russians and Ukrainians. So far, it has not been any other nations or any other mediators in these negotiations. But in those negotiations, the Ukrainians have said, the Ukrainians have indicated, have made it clear to the Russians, they will not give up their territorial integrity. And that, in other words, the Ukrainians are not going to give up on Donbass. They're not going to give up on Crimea. They will maintain some way to continue that challenge. That is, if there's a negotiated settlement, they may agree to disagree on Crimea, the Russians and the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians will not give up their claim to Donbass, to the Donetsk and Luhansk components of Donbass. But the Russians have occupied Donbass for 8 years, as you know, and it is likely that in any form of the negotiation, that they will continue to control, the Russians will continue to control Donbass for some period of time until something else can be worked out. The Ukrainians will not give up the principle, but they may recognize that in the near term, they're not going to be able to take back Donbass or Crimea. On the long, again, they won't give up on the longer term. So this will be something that will continue.
Other questions, please? Here and then here. Let's take both questions, shall we?
Ambassador, I was taken by your comment that there's relative peace from 1946 to 2014. The history of 1939 to 1945 brought us atrocities that, much like what we see now, and brought us the creation of the UN. The UN now seems to be taking a relatively quiet position on all of this. Let's say this, whether this goes short or long in Ukraine, what do you see as the likely outcome to, with regard to the validity of the UN?
And let's take one more question then, Ambassador, if that's okay.
Oh,
Sure.
okay. It's a different one. This
No,
is
go ahead.
Charlotte. I was wondering, what is the percentage of the Ukrainian population that are separatists who are helping the Russians from the inside?
Good question. Okay, so just again, the person who asked the UN question, whose name is
Donald.
Donald.
Donald. Thanks, Donald. And the
Charlotte.
person who asked the separatist question is
Charlotte.
Charlotte.
Charlotte. Thank you, Donald and Charlotte. All right, good. So Donald, on the UN, this is a great question. And it's very timely, as you know, I don't know if you noticed, but yesterday the United Nations Security Council had a meeting, and President Zelensky beamed in, gave a impassioned plea to the Security Council, UN Security Council, to do something. He said, if this is exactly what you said, set up in after the late 40s, 1945, after the end of the war, and then put together the UN to try to do this, to try to keep the peace, to try to take actions that would stop wars. And President Zelensky made the impassioned plea, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you stopping this war? Why aren't you stopping these atrocities? Exactly what you said, Donald, that the atrocities before and during World War II are horrific. And we're seeing the same kinds of things today. And President Zelensky asked the right question that you're asking. Why aren't you doing anything? And it's a very good question that I think we have to give a lot of thought to. But I think the problem is, as we know, the Russians are on the Security Council. The Russians have a veto, as do we, as do the Chinese, French, and Brits. There are 5 countries with a veto in the Security Council, which means that the Security Council is no longer able to address these kinds of issues, where one of those 5, in this case, Russia, is the aggressor. The UN Security Council is just not made for that. And President Zelensky, when he pointed this out, he said, what are you for? What's the purpose? He's got a good question. He's got a great question. I think we need to address this. There may be the need for something else that can keep the peace in this world. I mean, we talked about one way earlier. We talked about we'd like to get back to where nations respect each other's boundaries, respect each other's sovereignty, and thus don't invade each other. And then it's not might makes right. It's not big against the being able to dominate the small. No spheres of influence like we had in previous times. But if we want to do that, then we need to have respect for sovereignty, or we need to have an international body that enforces something, that is able to do something itself to keep the peace. And right now we don't have that. Right now we don't have it. President Zelensky is exactly right. So I think this is a challenge for us, for Americans. It's a challenge for World Affairs Councils, frankly, to be thinking about this and making suggestions and coming up with new ideas, because clearly it's not working right now. So Donald, I think you got a great question. And let me try to answer Charlotte's question. And then Chris, if we can come back, Donald, I'd love to have your thoughts on that question. I'd love to hear what you think about the UN, because I think this is a real challenge. Charlotte, on your question about what percentage are separatists. So the population of Ukraine is about somewhere between 40 and 44 million people. And that, however, some 4 or 5 million have already fled into Poland and Romania, fled into Eastern Europe. And in the only place there are separatists, which are really Russian-led and fomented separatists, are in the Donbass part of Ukraine, that I think Greg asked about earlier, as to whether or not Donbass would stay. The short answer, Charlotte, what percentage are separatists? If you include those people who are living in Donbass, who are now basically Russian. If you let me put it the other way. If you don't include those people living in Donbass that are governed by, ruled by, dominated by, oppressed by the Russians, if you don't include them, how many of the rest of Ukrainians in the rest of the country, not in that occupied part, are separatists? The answer is zero. The answer is zero. It doesn't matter if they speak Russian or Ukrainian. It doesn't matter if they are from the east or the west, north or the south. The Ukrainians who are living outside of those occupied territories is zero. There are none. They are entirely united against Russia. They're entirely supportive of a strong, independent, free European Ukraine. That's where they want to go. The polls, the polling that supports this, Charlotte, shows that President Zelensky, as the president of the country, has 92, probably not, above, probably 93, 94% support around the country. And those 5 or 6% that didn't vote for President Zelensky are still opposing Russia. So that's why I say it is, other than in the occupied territories, where the Russians dominate. Other than that, there are no Ukrainians who want to separate from Ukraine. But Chris, are we able to go back to Donald and ask him his question?
Absolutely. Donald, do you want to come back on that one?
Sure. So again, I guess picking up on what you said about the Security Council, it seems to me, as a complete non-expert, I have to admit up front, that the UN has created this, that the Security Council is largely created around the reality of politics in 1945. Joe Stalin might go kill 41 million instead of 40, so he gets a seat, and France gets a seat because you know, they whine a lot, and so they're on there permanently. But the era of that need and those selections for permanence is irrelevant today, and yet I read that there's no mechanism according to the charter by which to change the Security Council. So I don't have an answer, but I certainly have a lot of questions.
I don't have an answer. I have questions as well. So one of the things that's happening now is in the General Assembly, where no one has a veto. Every nation has the same vote as everybody else, every other nation. And they have voted, they've actually voted a couple of times on this Russia invasion of Ukraine, and 141 nations vote to condemn Russia, and 5 nations oppose that resolution. And the 5 are the ones you'd expect. Russia, of course, opposes that resolution. Belarus is the second one. Syria, North Korea has opposed, has supported the Russians, opposed this resolution, and then Eritrea for some reason I can't explain. But 141 to 5. So in the General Assembly, it's clear what the sentiment is, and in the General Assembly, they are voting. The General Assembly can do a couple of things. They can't act. They can't take They can't take actions and send troops and peacekeeping forces like the Security Council can. But the General Assembly can do other things, and the General Assembly can kick people out of, kick nations out of certain committees in the UN, like the Human Rights Committee. And so there's a process of kicking them out. So now people might ask, okay, what does that do? Nothing much. But part of the answer might be, well, I've heard some people say, Donald, and that's your very good question. Maybe we start another organization. We leave the UN behind. Maybe we start another organization that is of kind of like-minded nations, democracies, that would band together to defend democracy, as opposed to band together, as opposed to like NATO, that it's a military alliance. And you would just leave the UN behind somehow, and the Russians could continue to exercise their veto, but no one would be there. Anyway, it's a right question, Donald. I'm glad you're asking the question. We need to start thinking about that issue.
That's a great question. I'm just going to jump in on that quickly and say that, of course, and Ambassador Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong here, but over the past 20 years, there have been a number of attempts to kind of remake the Security Council. All of them have failed, not the least of which is because the 5 permanent members, including the United States, don't wish to change the current situation. And so, although there's been attempts, it's not worked so far.
It has not worked. You're exactly right.
So, Ambassador, we have a question from one of our high school classrooms. While I give you that, I'll just remind people in the room, think up another question. And if you wouldn't mind giving us your name when you ask the question. All right, this comes from the students at Bozeman High School. What can I do as a student to help the situation in Ukraine?
Great question from Bozeman High School. And there are things that you can do. First of all, you're doing it right now. That is, learn about this. Dig in, read the papers, do some research on your own. Figure out what the background of this war is, because you will be better informed, and you'll be able to do more things as you learn about this. So the first thing is stay informed, get informed, and second, let people know. I was just talking with a couple of congressmen, and they are fully supportive of Ukraine, and they're fully supportive of Ukraine, and they fully oppose the Russians because they know, these congresspeople know, that their constituents care about this, and they know, the congresspeople and senators and congressmen, congresswomen, they represent you, they represent us, and we let them know what we think. And so first is get informed, and second is tell your government officials at the local level, but also in Washington, how you feel about this. The third thing you can do is go on there are enormous number of websites that are gathering funds, that are raising money for a variety of things. And this depends then on what you care about. So there are some people who care about the suffering of Ukrainians because they don't have the medical supplies that they need. And so a lot of people are raising money to gather both money, but also medical equipment that they can send to the Ukrainians to help them in that problem. There are others who want to support the Ukrainian military. I talked about how important it is that the Ukrainian military have support from the West, and they're getting, of course, support from our government and from NATO governments. But there are people who want to contribute to that as well, and that's fine. And there are websites and organizations that are helping find, protective gear, for example, for the military, the helmets, armored vests, these kinds of things. So there's that. Then there are people who want to help out these 4 or 5 million Ukrainian refugees, Ukrainians who have left their homes, been driven out of their homes by the Russians, and they're going into Eastern Europe. And to the credit of the Polish people in particular, but others as well, the Romanians, the Moldovans are very poor, and they're welcoming these Ukrainians into their homes. But the Poles have accepted somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million Ukrainians have come into Poland. And they're in homes, and they're in schools, and they're in churches. The Poles have reached out to, have opened their arms and their homes and their hearts to these Ukrainians to make them feel welcome, to give them something to eat, a place to stay, some jobs while they're there. So the Poles have really demonstrated the humanity of this and openness. And there are organizations who are supporting those refugees, there's some Polish organizations, there are Ukrainian organizations. And I tend to look first to Ukrainian organizations on the ground who are doing work with those refugees, helping them get across the border, helping them get resettled. They know where their work. The world, the World Kitchen. I don't know if you noticed this, but there is that organization is doing incredible work. So that's a specific one you can take a look at. But there are websites that you can find. You all, and the Bozeman High School students are much better than I am at finding this, I'm sure. But you will find them, and just pick out the ones that you want to support. So get informed, tell people about it, help out in the way you can.
That's great advice, Ambassador. I'm just going to add quickly to this is the students in Bozeman High know that over the past few weeks, we've had a series of webcasts specifically for our Montana schools. About 3 weeks ago, we had a gentleman who was living 2 miles south of Kyiv, who came on to talk to over 600 Montana students about what is it like to be sitting there in a war. About 10 days later, his 2 children, 16 and 17-year-old Ukrainian teenagers, came on and spoke to nearly 1,000 Montana students about what is it like to be a kid sitting 2 miles south of Kyiv in a war. So we're also supporting this and trying to keep our students informed. Bozeman High has been a big part of that. And I was very happy, Ambassador, to hear you talk about World Kitchen. Last month, we did a fundraiser here with a number of partner nonprofits. We raised over $12,000 for World Kitchen.
Great, great.
So we're trying to do that as well. So thanks for that, Ambassador. Other questions here in the room?
Yeah, I got a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so my name's Rob. So my question is, what tools sort of remain in the West toolbox to try and kind of influence the outcome here, other than, right, we've already seen sanctions and probably see more of that. We see kind of arms shipments and some support there. Direct conflict seems to be, really off the table. Is there anything else, available that, the kind of United West can do to influence the outcome?
Rob, a great question. And you're right. We need tools to try to affect this outcome, and the tools go in both directions that you mentioned. That is, it's support for Ukraine, in particular their military, but they're going to need support after this war ends. By the way, the Ukrainians, and Chris, you may have heard from the Ukrainians when you talk with all the students, talk to them. But the Ukrainians that I've talked to, they don't talk about when the war ends. They talk about when we win, when we're victorious, when we have victory. That's the way Ukrainians think about it, because they will win. I am sure that their commitment, their determination will prevail in the end. So when they are talking to us, they try to answer, Rob, your question and about the tools. And we can support the Ukrainians with weapons, as you've mentioned. There are more weapons, by the way, that we can provide. We have provided, by and large, small arms, some of these anti-tank weapons we've probably all seen, these anti-aircraft weapons, shoulder fired. There are heavier duty weapons that we are only now starting to provide, including armored vehicles. Rob, you mentioned conflict, direct conflict, meaning U.S. soldiers. You're right. So far that has not been an issue, and President Biden, nor have I heard anyone really talk about wanting to send U.S. soldiers into Ukraine to fight the Russians. But we can provide more and heavier weapons for the Ukrainians to use against the Russians. The Ukrainians are fighting on our behalf. The Ukrainians are on the front line, as I mentioned earlier, and we should provide them everything we can to allow them to win. And so I'm glad you're asking about tools. So that's the first one. You mentioned sanctions, and you're right. We want to know what beyond sanctions, and there are export bans that are associated with these that are related to sanctions, which say that we're not going to provide these high-tech chips and other high-tech components for the Russian military. Or the Russian manufacturing base, for that matter, and that can be expanded, and we can ensure that there's no leakage there, and we can get more nations to agree to that. So there's that. there are, and just, I know you want to go beyond sanctions, but there are more sanctions that we can put on. There are still Russian banks who are still on the SWIFT system. This is this international financial system that allows banks to transfer or to notify transfers around the world. And there are a couple of Russian banks that are still there. However, the other big one, Rob, the other big tool that we're only starting to address is stopping the purchase of Russian oil and gas. The United States has done that. The Europeans are much more dependent on Russian oil and gas than we are. We can cut them off, and we have cut off the Russians. We're not. And the reason, of course, we do that, it's clear, but if we're buying oil and gas, or we, the United States or the Europeans buying oil and gas, that means money's going into Russia, and that money is going into their fight against Ukraine. So we're trying to cut them off from that. That's the purpose of the sanctions, but it's also the purpose of the import bans, that is banning the importation of oil and gas. Harder for the Europeans, but even the Europeans now are stepping up to this. I saw the Lithuanians have said they're not going to buy any more oil and gas from the Russians. The Germans have said that they are going to stop this pipeline. There's a natural gas pipeline that the Russians wanted to build from Russia into Germany, and the Germans have now turned it off. They're not going to let it go into operation. The whole European Union has committed to reducing its use of Russian natural gas by 2/3 by the end of this year. That's amazing if they can do that. It's that, but the big one, of course, is oil and gas sales of the Russians to us, and that we're buying that, and we're financing their military, and that will be the next big one. So those things, so bigger weapons, more sanctions, continued export controls, cutting off the sale, stopping buying the oil and gas. Those are the ones, Rob, that I would say. But if you got any other ideas, we'd love to have them.
Chris, can I comment on that?
You can comment, and then we're going to go to Deb for the next
Very
question.
quickly, they're still importing Russian oil and gas of the EU countries. They've set a date in the future, but the reality is they cannot afford to just shut that off right now. So it's still financing that. The Germans want LNG. U.S. has offered to not pay, but to export that. They need to build LNG facilities in order to receive that. Your comments and thoughts, though, this flies in the face of the administration in terms of their objectives to move towards more of a renewable type of energy future. How do you see the administration dealing with this conflict? Because there are those within the administration saying, hey, you're going to be exporting more natural gas, more oil. This is not what we want to be doing. And yet, if we're going to supply that, it's going to have to happen in that manner. So just any insights you can provide on that.
Robinson, this is still Rob, right?
No, this is Bob now.
Oh, it's Bob. Sorry, Bob. Yeah, so you're exactly right. This is a complicated issue. You're right. The Europeans are going to have a hard time meeting that pledge to cut by 2/3, and they can use our LNG would help them shift away from the Russians. I mean, basically, what we want to do is stop buying from the Russians, and we don't want them just stop using it. We want their industries to continue to heat their homes next winter. So they are going to need more gas from somewhere. They can get it from the Middle East, they can get it from here, from the United States, get it from Montana, they can get it from Latin America. So they do need to shift away from Russia toward these other sources. And I think that's the LNG terminals that you mentioned are important. They take a while, as you know better than I, to construct. But that's the direction that they're clearly going to go. You ask about the administration. So the administration, so I work in Washington, of course, and I talk to them a lot, and we make suggestions to them a lot based on these kind of conversations I'm having with you and others. We make a lot of suggestions to do things faster. Some of the ones that I just talked about in terms of the answer to Rob's question about tools. but I am impressed with the intensity that the administration is focusing on this. This is something they have never done before. They are working harder on this. The diplomats, the military, the people who are identifying weapons to go to the Ukrainians. I talk to them every day. They are this 24/7, literally 24/7. They are working this problem like I've never seen. As I said, even the diplomats and getting all of these nations to agree, both within NATO, but also within the European Union, as well as with the Far East, as well as the South Koreans, the Japanese, the New Zealanders, the Australians. That effort to have them all on board on sanctions, on support for Ukraine, on opposition to Russia in the UN, wherever, that's a major effort. So it is a complicated question, and Bob, you've asked the right question about how the energy policy all interacts. But it is going in that direction of support for Ukraine and opposition to Russia.
Okay, thank you. Deb?
Ambassador Taylor, thank you for joining us today. And my question kind of ties back to some of the discussions we've had already about the UN, but it gets more to the whole NATO aspect of this, right? So since the foundation of NATO against the Warsaw Pact forces, obviously a very different environment, and things have changed quite a bit. So if you were the Secretary General of NATO, what would you be thinking about in the years coming forward about how NATO as an organization can be maybe more effective in terms of dealing with conflict in those border states? I get it's a defensive treaty organization, but if I was the Secretary General right now, I would be very, very frustrated that I wasn't able to do more to help a neighboring state just because they weren't part of the treaty organization.
Deb, this is I am so glad you asked this question. I think this is exactly the right question we should be asking. That and I'll just say what you just said in a different way. That is, NATO didn't prevent this conflict. It so far has defended its members, and that's what it's supposed to do. That's what it was designed to do in 1947, whenever it was signed. And it has done that successfully, the most successful military alliance in history. And it has deterred the Soviet Union through all the Cold War, and has come out and is now reinventing itself thanks to President Putin. President Putin, let's be clear, is rejuvenating NATO, and it's doing what it's meant to do all along, which is defend its members. But there's a war going on in the middle of Europe. A war like we've not seen since World War II. So something's not right, and you've identified it. It's these nations that are not in NATO. Some, there may be some good reasons why not. But if you're Ukraine, if you're President Zelensky, and you look at some of your neighbors, you look at your neighbor Poland, and or other nations like Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia. You look at these nations that are in Eastern Europe, like Ukraine, and President Zelensky says, they're actually in a defensive alliance that is keeping them safe, and we're not. And President Zelensky thought for some time that he had applied to join, and Europeans have said pretty consistently, not now. Not now. So President Zelensky has got to look for other ways to secure himself. And one might be the Austria model. Deb, this goes to your question, what other ways can there be? What other structures might there be? Well, Ukraine might be pointing in the direction of an answer to your question. That is, if Ukraine, for example, and you've listed some of these other ones, Moldova or Georgia, or maybe Finland or Sweden, not members of NATO yet, they may want to join. They see the problem on their borders with this Russian aggressive actions. But there might be an answer to this question that President Zelensky asked: how can I, as a nation in Eastern Europe, not in NATO, how can I be secure? And one of the things he is thinking about is the Austrian model. That Austria, of course, is a member of the European Union, but not a member of NATO, so it's neutral in that sense. But President Zelensky wants more than that. He wants more than neutrality. Neutrality won't defend him if the Russians want to invade again. So he wants some guarantees, and this may start to get to your question, Deb, about what new arrangements might be in order, might be possible, that weren't possible before, but might be possible now, that would have what President Zelensky has suggested that might be possible is security guarantees from all of the UN Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council. So United States, France, Germany, Russia, and China would all, in President Zelensky's idea, would all guarantee, not just assure, not just promise not to invade, no, to actually have a legally binding guarantee that if anybody around Ukraine invades them again, that the guarantors, these nations that are giving these guarantees, the guarantors would come to the defense of Ukraine right away. That would be the commitment, a legally binding commitment. Now, this, of course, would be NATO commitment outside of NATO, Deb. And that's what I take from your question. And, you know, NATO is, it could either accept nations in, or it can set up something else. And not NATO wouldn't set this up. You know, NATO would not be in the business of setting this up, but individual nations, individual NATO nations, as well as others. I mean, they've invited the Ukrainians have invited the Israelis to join that, as well as the Turks and the Germans to join this group of guarantor nations. Nothing's agreed yet, of course. They're all. This is nothing. They're not even. We're not even close to an agreement, the end of war. But if they get to the point where they're ready to sit down, talk, negotiate, come up with answers to earlier questions about Donbass and earlier questions about whether Ukraine's in NATO or not. But when they get to that point where President Putin, goes back to my earlier point, President Putin decides he's not going to win on the ground, he sits down, has this conversation, then, Deb, there may be some thought given to how to restructure that part of Europe. And I think it's a great question. And let me do the same thing, Chris. Can I ask Deb if she's got any ideas about this?
No, unfortunately, I don't. You know, I do have questions about, you know, after having watched this for a month now, you know, all the saber rattling in the beginning about, oh, NATO really can't do anything more because there was a concern about, you know, how well the Russian military would perform. Well, we've kind of learned a lesson from that over the last month, and you know, NATO certainly has as well, and it's probably factoring into their thinking about, you know, what they would have done differently if they
right.
How they're thinking about it going forward. But no, I mean, it's a tough one because even if you have security guarantees from those countries, I mean, we've all seen, you know, you have guarantees until you don't, right?
Right.
So how does Ukraine get some kind of comfort that whatever guarantees are in place are not going to come back to bite them down the road?
Deb, you're absolutely right. And they're guaranteed until they're not. But that's why the Ukrainians want more than they got before. They gave up their nuclear weapons, you remember, in the mid-90s, and they got something of guarantees, but it turned out they weren't worth anything because the Russians invaded again, even though the Russians had signed that agreement when the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons. And so the Ukrainians want more than that. They want legally binding, not just these assurances. And the other thing that the Ukrainians will want in these negotiations is the ability to maintain a strong military, because in the end, that strong military is their best insurance. That's the only thing they can count on. They can only count on that, and they're going to want to maintain. And they've demonstrated that they've got a strong military.
Okay, we've got a question from our board president, Chuck Leonard.
Mr. Ambassador, again, thanks for joining us here today. At the recommendation of a professor in Russian studies here at the university, I went back and watched the speech that Putin gave in Munich, I think it was in 2017, to security councils of really the European Union. And, you know, there he listed a lot of his grievances, and he would not agree with you that post-World War II to 2014 was a period of everyone following the rules and prosperity. He he referred to it as a period of unipolar. It's all about the United States, and the United States got everything he wanted. So the pundits are pointing to this speech now saying this was Putin listing his grievances, kind of giving a warning, and also almost begging to be respected and having a seat at the table. So I have two questions. The first being, did our State Department ever respond to that speech?
I'm sure the answer is yes, Chuck. That is, the State Department has had discussions with the Russians. We had discussions, of course, earlier with the Soviets. Then the Soviets bought into those principles of sovereignty and of respect for borders. That was not a unipolar imposition. That was in particular during the Cold War that the Soviets bought into. The Helsinki principles were signed by the Soviet Union, and after the Soviet Union disappeared, the Russians then signed treaties with the Ukrainians and others that respected their sovereignty. I have already mentioned this Budapest memorandum where the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons in return for these assurances, which turned out not to be useful because the Russians invaded anyway. But there are other treaties that the Russians signed with the Ukrainians that said, you're sovereign, your borders are guaranteed until they weren't. But my point, Chuck, is that yes, we've had these conversations with the Soviets before them, and then the Russians over the years, and we stick by the principles that nations are sovereign. We stick by the principles that the Russians don't get. We're not going to give spheres of influence. That the violation of the Ukrainian sovereignty and killing of tens of thousands of Ukrainians is not justified in any way. It is not justified in any way. Putin can't tell you or us that there is any valid reason that he can point to, whether it's any speech that he ever gave, that is destroying that country and killing those civilians. There's no justifying it. Yeah, we heard him, and we signed treaties with them. When they violated treaties, we pulled out of them. So that conversation, yes, Chuck, took place, but there is no rationale. There's no justification for the crimes, the war crimes that President Putin is responsible for in Ukraine.
Yeah, that leads into the second part of my question. I wonder why we're not using Putin's own words in negotiations or against him, because in that speech, as you just alluded to, he mentioned the sovereignty of nations was so important. He said that numerous times. And then he also suggested that the United Nations should be the one where we voice our disagreements and where we settle these things, not NATO, but the United Nations. So why I'm not hearing anyone in the State Department or President Biden coming back to him, reminding him of that 2017 speech and saying, okay, let's do it your way, have the United Nations come in, you come in, let's figure this out.
Yeah, we should. Absolutely, we should. That said, President Putin has demonstrated that it doesn't matter what he said before. President Putin back in 2014, President Putin, after his soldiers, invaded Ukraine in Crimea, President Putin said for a long time, not us. Don't know who those are, Don't know who those little green men are with no insignia. Not us, not the Russians. A clear lie, an obvious lie. In the end, a couple of months later, he admitted it, that it was the Russians, that he had been lying. He also said, more recently, That is, when he was mounting all of these troops, all these Russian troops around three borders of Ukraine back last fall, last November, December, into January. And he said, nope, no, I'm not going to invade. These are just exercises. This is a military exercise. I'm not going to invade. Fact is, his people, Chuck, you will remember this, his people, Lavrov and other ministers, mocked the United States. They said, "What? We're not going to invade Ukraine. Yeah, it's just the Americans, fanning the flames. They're just trying to. They're just anti-Russian. They're trying to scare you. We're not going to invade Ukraine. That's a silly. Well, that was a lie. It was a clear lie. It's not clear that the ministers knew it, but Putin knew. This is all to say that, yeah, we should call him out. We absolutely should call him. We do call him out. You can be confident that we do call them out on those kind of commitments that he's made. We do that all the time. Whenever we are describing why we're so supportive of Ukraine, it's for this world order that he committed to. You're exactly right, Chuck. He committed to this world order, these rules. And now he's just torn them up. He's torn them up and he's lied about it. So, it's hard to, this just all goes to emphasize how important it is that Ukraine win, that Putin lose, because that's the only way we're going to get back to some kind of an order.
Ambassador, we have just over 10 minutes to go, and maybe time for one or two more questions here, and then we'll come to you if we have time.
Ambassador, thank you for your service first. And my name's Dave. And to kind of follow up with on Chuck's question, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Why Putin initiated this invasion? Why now? And as the second part, how does he get any traction with his people by voicing the rationale of denazifying Ukraine?
Excellent questions, Dave. Excellent questions. On the first one, question, why and why now? I think that President Putin has this and has had this obsession with Ukraine for his whole life, actually, because it's not just Putin with this obsession on Ukraine. It is Russia's obsession with Ukraine. Russia has tried to dominate the Ukrainian people. Ukrainian people have tried to convince their Russian brothers that they're actually a separate people. They were in the Soviet Union with the Russians, but the Ukrainians, even then, maintained their nationhood and their language and their culture and their history and their heroes. And yet the Russians, whether they be czars or Soviets or Putin now, the Russians never accepted that. They never accepted Ukraine as a nation, as a sovereign nation. And this gets to your question about why now. Putin famously saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the last century. And he said he wants to reassemble the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. And the biggest part, the most important component of that reassembling is Ukraine, for all kinds of reasons, which we can talk about. But so he has had this obsession with Ukraine and has tried to control it, dominate it in the ways that czars and Soviets tried to dominate it as well over the centuries. And Putin tried, and he wasn't succeeding. And this gets, Dave, to your question about why now. He was failing. Ukraine, despite all of the efforts of the czars and the Soviets and Putin, despite all of the efforts to dominate and bring back in Ukraine to the fold, into the empire, Ukraine was moving the other way. And every year that went by, Ukraine was moving closer to Europe, more integrated into Europe, into more organizations. The Ukrainian people were more oriented toward Europe. I saw it when I was there in 2006, 2009. I saw it more in 2014, and you see it even more now. There's no question. An answer to somebody's question about what percent of Ukrainians want to separate and go to Russia. Zero. That has been happening. That movement of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people into Europe and into European institutions has been going on, and that Putin saw was inevitable, inexorable, unless he did something. And so he wanted to stop that. And every day that went by, it got harder. So time wasn't on his side. And so he invaded. And he probably thought that the United States wouldn't do anything. He probably looked at Afghanistan. He said, oh, the United States is pulling out of the world. They didn't, look what they did in Kabul, pulling out. And then he saw, Frau Merkel was leaving. She left Germany. So Germany had a new government. France has a presidential election coming up. Macron's running for re-election. He's probably not going to do anything. The Brits are absorbed in Brexit, and they're not going to do anything. So Putin probably thought that the West was in disarray. He's losing Ukraine. Every day that goes by, it's harder for him. Every day that goes by, the Ukrainian military gets stronger. So there's time's not on his side, and he thought that he could go in and do it. Well, he was surprised by the strength of the alliance. He was surprised by the Americans not receding. The Americans are not going back into their shell. The Americans are standing up to him, and I'm sure that was a surprise to him. By the way, President Xi in China probably is noticing this as well. And Putin was also surprised at the strength of the Ukrainians. So all to say that he misjudged, totally misjudged. That's the why and the why now. And then your question about denazification. He's looking for some way, Putin's looking for some way to justify this war. He can't find one. There's no justification. There was no rationale. The Ukrainians were disciplined. They would not be provoked. He tried to provoke them in the same way he provoked the Georgians back in 2008. He tried, he failed. So he said, well, I'll try the Nazification card, the Nazi card. And, we know that President Zelensky is Jewish, or his parents, he has Jewish roots, so it's ludicrous. It is ludicrous for him to say that. For a while there, Ukraine was the only country, it was only the second country in the world that had a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. Second only, of course. So President Putin had no way to justify this war. So he tried the Nazi card, and it failed. So, but the answer to your question, though, Dave, is that he can still convince enough Russians that he's doing the right thing, even if they don't believe the Nazi business. That he's got them on his side. He can control what they hear every day, every hour. He can control what they hear, and the Russian people say that they're with him.
Okay, let's go to last question here. If we can keep it maybe under 5 minutes so we can wrap up. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us. My name is Julie. And I think it's a follow-up question to what you were just talking about, the Russian people. First, I wonder from your perspective how important it is that the Russian people support this war. Does it matter? Or does Putin is he just able to do whatever he wants, and even if the Russians really don't have a way to rise up against that anyway? And secondly, if it does matter, if we talk about other tools in our toolbox, where are we on fighting Putin's propaganda within his own country? He seems to be very capable of spreading propaganda in our country. What have we done to sort of be able to get information infiltrated to the Russian people?
Julia, great question. Great question. And you're right to ask the first question that you did. That is, does it matter to Putin whether the Russian people are with him or not? I think it might, actually. The Russian people in the end are going to decide whether or not Putin continues. As we know, he's changed his constitution. So in constitutional terms, he can stay in power until 2036 or something. It's crazy. But President Putin, realizes that he's terrified of these color revolutions. He's terrified of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, of the Rose Revolution in Georgia. He's probably worried. He sees all these Arab Spring ones that a couple of deposed some dictators. And he sees recently in Kazakhstan, there was uprising there, and they had to really crack down in Kazakhstan. He sees what happens in Belarus. The Belarusians have been in the streets opposing Lukashenko for years now, and Lukashenko is worried about that. He's got to crack down as well. So I think Putin does worry about that. It's probably not the main thing he worries about. He's probably now worried about how badly his army is doing. But in the end, the Russian people or the Russians around him may take matters into their own hand. That's not something that we can do anything about or say anything about. President Biden didn't really mean that when he was talking about regime change. He didn't say that. He didn't say regime change. He just said he shouldn't stay in power, and that's his true statement. But then the other question is, there's the right question about fighting propaganda, and there it's interesting. It's hard to get through to the Russian people because of, as I say, they are the media is totally controlled by the Kremlin, but the Kremlin media does react to certain things. And so when President Biden calls President Putin a thug or a war criminal, or makes this comment in Warsaw about how he shouldn't be in power, the Russian media responds. Now, they, of course, trash that. And they say, see, the Americans are trying to, they're threatening us and this. But the Russian people start to think about, it's getting through to the Russian people that the world, is opposed to them. They are seeing, and Putin is okay with that. He's okay with kind of Russia fortress, but the Russian people are not so okay with that. They like traveling. They like buying things from abroad. In particular, the young people. The young Russians under like 24, but even 18 to 24 range, they have good feelings about the Ukrainians, despite all this propaganda. So it is getting through, Julie. It's the right question, and we've actually done some pretty good things. I mean, the selective release of intelligence was an attempt to get into that stream, into that media stream. And it was pretty effective on occasion that was done. So we're not as good at it, but we're starting to take action against that. And as I say, some of these things do get into the Russian people.
Ambassador, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to come all the way out here, albeit virtually, to talk to us about this very important issue. And thanks also to all of our friends at the U.S. Institute of Peace. They're very good and long-term partners of the Montana World Affairs Council. So thanks to you, first of all, and your colleagues. I'd also like to thank our hosts here at First Interstate Bank, Jocelyn Lane and her team. Thank you so much for hosting and supporting more broadly all of our work across the state. And thanks again to the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank, who help us bring this distinguished speaker program to you and others all around the state. I just want to quickly say a couple things. If you're new to these kind of events and our organization, next Thursday, what do Montanans like to do? Well, we like to drink beer. So next Thursday at Imagination Brewery, just down here, we're launching the World Affairs Council Brew and International Trivia Night. Of course, that is just a warm up to our fundraiser on the 29th, asking, are you smarter than a high schooler? We've got a great night at Paddlehead Stadium, barbecue, drink, hanging out, and trivia. You can find more information on our website. And lastly, we do have on April 21st, in partnership with the Max Baucus Institute, Senator John Kerry. And so these are the kinds of things that we're trying to bring to Montana, to our communities, and to our state. And so I'll just finally thank everybody here for coming. I really appreciate your participation. Thanks for those who are watching online. I would ask you, if you like this kind of thing, if you think this is good for you, for your community, for your state, please support us. How can you do that? It's easy. You can tell your friends. Just simply let people know what we're doing. I would really appreciate that. Another thing you can do is participate. Come to our events like this one and others. You can find out more on the website. And finally, of course, you can join as a member, and all of that information is available on the website. If you'd like to talk to me or our board president or my colleague, Nikki Geisler, our programs director, after this, just come by and say hello. So with that, Ambassador Taylor, one more great and big Montana thank you to you. Be well, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. Great to be here.